Hi, everyone. I thought I would actually go ahead and film myself walking through this React slider by example to just get a little bit better at the useRef hook. I followed along with the tutorial that's linked in the book that I talked about in our mentor session, but I thought giving you a chance to maybe watch me live code it and code along could be useful. So this is just going to help us explore getting more comfortable with the useRef hook. So I'm coding this in a code sandbox here, just like I do in the mentor sessions. And to start out, one of the first things that they mention in this tutorial is using something called styled components. And styled components is a dependency that is an external CSS in JavaScript library, and we can add it to our app in Code Sandbox really easily using this add dependency bar here. If you wanted to do that on your like in VS Code or in a repo that you've initialized on your machine, you would need to run npm install with styled components, but in Code Sandbox, all you have to do is come to this box here, and we're going to type styled components, and that's going to add that dependency. And so we'll be able to access what we need to here. And like I said, styled components is just a CSS in JS library. And so when we import this styled here, it allows us to create components using HTML element names and writing CSS strings directly into a JavaScript file. You will see this used in professional level applications. Styled components has some competitors that do similar things. Emotion is another really popular CSS and JS library. There's one called Stitches. There's quite a few, and they all work to some degree similarly. They all have their advantages and disadvantages. So in order to construct a style component, we just call that style that we've imported, and then dot, and then whatever HTML element we want this to render as. So in our case, we're going to call a div, and then they've provided for us some properties, some CSS properties for the styling of this slider that we're going to build. So I'm actually just going to copy this over. So we've got a position relative, a border radius of 3, background color, and a defined height for the slider. And then we're also going to construct a styled thumb. And I'll say it is totally possible to just do this with native CSS, like in a style CSS file. You absolutely can do that. We're going to go ahead and construct this styled thumb as well. Okay, so what this means now is that we actually will have access to a component, just like any other component that we might make in React, called styled slider and styled thumb, and they'll work exactly like that. So let's actually go ahead and build this out. So we're going to have a styled slider that's going to hold the styled thumb. So we want an opening and closing tag for the styled slider. And then inside of that, we're going to put in the styled thumb. Oops. And if I hit save on that, we see now we have this slider bar here. And let me actually go ahead and I'm just going to add, this isn't in the tutorial. I'm just doing this because I think it's easier to see what's going on. We'll just give it a little header so that we know what we're doing here. Okay, so now that we have the slider and the thumb, and we see when we mouse over it, it gives us this like pointer, and that's because of this property cursor pointer here. But if I'm clicking, nothing's happening. So what we want to have happen, and let's think through how this moves. What we want to have happen is that when I click down on the mouse and hold the mouse button down, and then move my mouse with the mouse button pressed down, we want to be able to slide the thumb along the slider, right? And then when I release the mouse, when we have the mouse go up, we want the slider to stop, or sorry, the thumb to stop where our mouse has stopped on the slider, right? So the first event in that chain is that the mouse goes down, right? And the mouse goes down on the thumb, right? We want there to be, when the mouse clicks on the thumb, we want it to start listening to what's happening, right? And so we can add an event listener. So before we get too deep into that though, we also want to set up our actual slider component, right? So let's go ahead and say, function slider, and we're going to return, and actually let's move these. To live inside of the slider. That makes a little bit more sense. And then we'll use slider inside of our app. So there, everything's still rendering, but we've kind of abstracted this out because this is going to get a little hairy in here. So we have a slider component that's holding the styled slider and the styled thumb, and we've taken that into app. At this point, and they don't do this in the tutorial, but at this point, I'm looking at this file and going, there's a lot happening for slider and maybe not as much happening in this app component, but we're in this app file. And I think that anytime you have something like this going on, probably a good time to think about maybe creating a new file just for, oops, that didn't add the file I wanted. Just for that own component. So let's make a slider.js file. And let's go ahead and just bring all of this into the slider.js file, hit save on that, and then we're going to import, oops, we need to export this first. Export default. And then we're going to import slider from that slider file. Okay. So now we're going to work here just in this slider file. And let's go ahead and add our refs for our styled slider and our styled thumb. So we're going to say const slider ref equals useRef. And that's going to import it from React. And like I mentioned in our mentor session, the book uses this react.useRef. You can absolutely do that instead. Or you can import it and then be able to call it directly. It's totally up to you. Okay, so we've initialized these refs. And now let's set the ref attribute on our components here to match up with the refs that we've set up. Oops. Okay. So we now have direct access to those components. And we talked about wanting to be able to listen for that mouse down event on the thumb. So we're going to say on mouse down, and we're going to give it a handle mouse down handler function. And then we're going to go ahead and define that here. Oops. And that's going to receive the event. And then we're going to do some stuff. So we also want not just the mouse down to fire, but we also want there to be some listening towards the mouse moving and the mouse coming up, right? But if we add those onto the styled thumb, we might get some unintended side effects. So what we actually want to have happen is that those event listeners on mouse move and on mouse up actually only fire if mouse down has been triggered before that, right? Because I don't need an event happening on mouse move over the thumb, but I haven't clicked, right? We wouldn't want that to happen. And if somehow I was able to trigger mouse up without triggering mouse down over the thumb, we also wouldn't want those effects to occur as well, right? So what we can do is inside of handle mouse down, we can add some event listeners to the mouse move and mouse down actions using just vanilla JavaScript, right? So we're going to add an event listener mouse move, and that's going to call a handle mouse move function, right? And then we can do the same here. Add event listener for mouse up, and we'll have a handle mouse up function, right? And then of course we need to define those things. So let's go ahead and just shell out our handle mouse move. Also going to receive the event. And we'll do the same here with a handle mouse up, right? Okay. So what we want to have happen is that when that mouse move fires, we want to be able to track how far from where the mouse was when it went down to the moment that it's getting released to calculate where the thumb position should land, right? And along the point of it moving, we should be calculating that new X in that XY axis, where X is our horizontal line. We need to be calculating that within the mouse move, right? So should and then the mouse up, we want to actually remove the mouse up and mouse move event listeners, right? And the reason for that is the same reason that we didn't add them on that styled thumb to begin with. So we can go ahead and do that really quickly. And I'm going to be really cheap about this and just say, remove the event listener by copy and pasting here and changing this to document.remove event listener for mouse up and mouse move. So that handles our handle mouse up event. And you'll notice that it actually didn't need the event, so we can actually take that parameter out. And then now we need to calculate for this new x, right? First, we need to, on that mouse down, get the diff between where the mouse currently is and where the thumb's outer left side is, right? So this part of the thumb. And so we're actually going to initialize a different ref. We're going to call it diff, and that's going to be a useRef as well. But this is a different implementation of useRef. If you remember in the mentor session, I talked about that ref can certainly be used with this ref property, where it's specifically referencing an element rendered on the DOM. But it can also just be used to store a value that we don't want to lose reference to. And we're going to talk and see a little bit more why that matters here in a moment. So what we want to have happen is we actually want to calculate diff.current. Remember that the object of useRef has a single property called current. So whenever we want to save a new value explicitly to our useRef variable, we actually have to call diff.current, and we also have to call diff.current to access the value that's stored in our useRef variable, right? So diff.current, and then we're going to say event.clientX. And client X is equal to the mouse's position, its X position. And then we're going to subtract the thumb ref dot current, right? We're going to call get bounding client rec, which is, oh, sorry, rect, which is get the bounding rectangular like measurements, right? And then we want the left positioning of that. Let me have this wrap here. And so now we've changed the value of, or we've set the value of diff.current to be this difference between where the mouse is and where that left positioning of the thumb is. So now we're able to take this and start to calculate our new X positioning for the mouse movement. So let's go ahead and say let new X, and we're going to talk about why we're using let here in just 1 second. And again, we're actually going to subtract the event.clientX, that mouse X position, from diff.current again, because the mouse is actively moving. So this has changed by the time that this is firing, right? This, even though we had calculated this here, we had included this in our diff.current, this positioning of the mouse has changed at the point that the mouse is moving. And so we're re-including it in this calculation. So diff.current, and then we're also going to subtract now the slider ref .current dot get bounding client rect, and then also the left positioning. And that's that outer left side. So we've calculated this new X as we're moving. And then we're going to say the end of the slider is equal to slider ref dot current that we're actually talking about the slider component, right? And then we want offset width minus thumbRef dot current dot offset width. So that's getting the end of the slider, the width number for that, but it's removing the width of the thumb from that. And then const start, and that's going to be equal to 0. Here's why we used let with new. And I'll explain why this matters here in a second. We'll comment it out after we write it. So if new is less than start, which start is 0, if new x is less than start, we're going to say that new x is equal to start. And then if new x is greater than end, we're going to say new x equals end. We're going to come back to why we needed to do this here in just a moment. So we've done this calculation to find the new x position, but we need to be able to save it to the style of our thumb. And the way that they have you set this up in the tutorial is to create this utility function called get percentage. And that takes a current and a max, and it returns, so it does a calculation to calculate the percentage that it needs to slide along, or the percentage of the parent, so that we know how far to position the slider over. So in order to do that, we take 100 times that current value and then divide by the max value, right? So it's just giving us a percent value of that. To call that get percentage utility function, we're going to initialize another variable called new percentage here. And we're going to say get percentage, and we're going to give it that new x and an end. And then they also have you initialize another utility function called get left. And all get left does is return a string of CSS. So we pass it a value, and then it just gives us back this interpolated string with a CSS calc function in it. And it's setting that x as a percentage minus half of the width of the thumb. And so we can then, inside of our handle mouse move function, we can set the thumb ref dot current dot style dot left. So we're setting the left property. We've now accessed the dot style attribute of that div and the left attribute of its style attribute. and we're saying left is equal to get left, and then we're going to pass that new percentage that we calculated up here to it. When we hit save, we should now be able to slide the slider along the page, which is pretty cool. Okay, so why does this matter? Well, let's comment it out and see. Now I can slide the slider all the way off. So what this does is it restricts the bounds of the thumb to the width of the slider, which we want because we don't want it to slide further than we have it set up for. Okay, so why do we use this useRef? Like what's the point of this? Because we could actually do all of this with useState, right? We could set this up and say that, oh, the X value is, you know, a piece of state, and every time that the mouse moves, we just want to change the state based on the diff, right? And we could access all of this exactly the same, in the exact same way. And there's no reason that we shouldn't be able to do that, right? But if you remember how state works, is that every time state changes, React re-renders, right? And that costs effort from your application. So when you have a small application that is just a simple header and a slider, that may not seem like that big of a deal. But when this slider is actually part of a giant survey form with 50 questions that are rendered on a single page, and all of those sliders are triggering some degree of a re-render as React updates the state. And because you have to lift that state higher, because you need to be able to access the values that are returned by those sliders moving so that you can save them, that means that every single time that someone moves a slider, the page re-renders. And that is not a great scenario. So useRef, if you remember from our mentor session, I mentioned does not trigger re-renders. And so this allows us to explicitly or imperatively manipulate the DOM without triggering a full re-render of the page, which is pretty cool, right? Okay, so the other thing that they have us build out in this tutorial is the ability to pass props into this component that we've built so that we could have a little bit more explicit control. So they have you pass an initial value, and we're going to set that to 0, and a max value, and we're going to set that to 10. They set it to 25 in the tutorial, but I want to set it to 10. And then now slider is receiving some props. I'm going to deconstruct them and say initial and max here. And I want it to give me that initial positioning of where the thumb is based on that initial and max value. So in order to do that, we're going to need to get a percentage, but based on those values that we got from the props, right? So we can create another variable called initial percentage, and that is going to call that get percentage utility function that we have with initial and max. Oops. And then what we can do is inside of slider thumb, we can call that style property, right? And style property is an object. So we need two curly braces to access the object. And we're going to say left is equal to, and we're going to call it get left utility function. And we're going to pass in that initial percentage value that we have, right? Okay, so we saw it's set to 0 here. If I change this, we see that, oh, now the slider starts in a different place. We can still move it, but we can define that starting position for the slider, right? And it should align to, where we think it should land for half of 10, right? Cool. So the other thing that we might want to do is be able to get the value from that slider. So we might want to pass some sort of value up from the slider component. So in order to do that, we're going to pass a prop of an onChange function to the slider component. So we're going to call this onChange, and we're going to pass a really simple function here that does value, and then it's going to just console log value. And so then inside of slider, we can deconstruct that onChange function. And we want to get the value from the slider once it's finished moving. So one thing that I didn't like in the tutorial was they actually put this inside of the handle mouse move, but that means that onChange fires every time the mouse moves. And I think that we probably only want it to fire once the mouse is done moving. So we can actually put it in our handle mouse up, and we can call onChange. And then we need to be able to get the value from the slider. So we're going to write another utility function, and this is going to be called get value. And this get value function is going to take, I actually rewrote this differently than they did it in the tutorial, but get value is going to take the current X, the max value, and the end X positioning. So current X, max value, and end X positioning. And it is going to calculate the current X times the max value. And then it's going to divide that by the end X. So if inside of our mouse move function, we then want to save the value, because we're currently not saving this positioning that happens after we calculate the new X and the new position, right? We don't store that anywhere outside of this handle mouse move. So we actually are going to set up another ref, and we're going to call this current X, or I'm sorry, current ref. And that current ref is going to be set after we've set this. We're going to call current ref dot current, which is kind of funny. And then we're going to say text content equals, and then we're going to set that to a new value, right? So we're going to call get value and we want the current X, which would be our new X. We want the max value, which is our max, right, that we get from props. And then we want that end X, which is called end in here. And we've set that to that current ref. And what this means is that we can not only pass that value up when this changes, because now when the mouse up happens, we can send that up with the on change because it's saved here, right? But we also can set a header that's going to display that. So they have you use another style component, const, and this is slider, header equals styled. And then I'm going to just copy the styling over here. Style div display flex. That. And we're going to set up this style. Oh, sorry. It's slider header. And we're going to use open and closing tags. Now we see it's upset. We need a React fragment, right? And inside of this header, we're going to say, first, we want to see that initial value, right? And then they have you use some HTML escapes to be able to write the slash here and the max value. And then the other thing they've done is they've used this strong HTML element and they're enclosing the initial inside of that. And then we're giving that a ref of, current ref. Okay. So let's see what happens when we hit save on this. We now see it's starting at 0 out of 10 because we set up that max there. There's a slash rendering. And when we click to slide the thumb, we see it's showing these new values. Now, it's showing these new values with some really intense precision. I don't know about you, but maybe that's not super useful. They use this number dot format scenario, but I'm actually just really quickly going to use math trunc, which truncates any number to the shortened version of it. And so now it's just going to show whole numbers here. And there you are. There's a few different ways to use useRef, some explicitly referencing HTML elements on the page, and some referencing values that we don't want to lose access to, but we also don't want to be pieces of state that cause re-renders on our page. And all of these allow us to implicitly manipulate elements in the DOM tree. I hope that that helps you feel a little bit more confident about how to use useRef. And if you'd like to continue to explore, there's a few other tutorials that are linked in the textbook on how to use useRef. And there's also some challenge versions of this assignment. If you go and look through the tutorial, they suggest like exploring how to do this with a with use state to like see how it changes the rendering. But thanks so much.